try something different and show a spending breakdown of her very early days, back when it was much less expensive, before we discovered all of her veterinary bills and things. But Q1 of 2024, in our budgeting app, which we set to Q1 by our starting date and our ending date, and then just 14 selected categories where I have everything marked with Lyla here. And all we really have is not much. We've got the vet bill that we paid when our breeder still had the dog before we moved apartments and then took possession a week after we moved. We have our first pet rent, and we have the adoption fee that we paid in 2 installments. Now, the reason we ended up getting from a breeder, well, we have basically 3 options when it was time to look for a dog. And since I was working at home 100% of the time, that made it feasible to actually have one. But we wanted one that, A, was relatively obedient, B, easy to manipulate, as in not too big, and C, somewhat very good temperament, as it were. And a Sheltie happens to fit all 3 of those in spades. I have a lot of friends that love border collies, and so they recommended Shelties. One in particular, way out west, the Pacific Northwest, has no fewer than 4 of them over the course of her lifetime. And my late grandmother used to rescue border collies. I think she had at least one dating back to at least 1999 until she passed away in 2018. So although I wasn't familiar with Shelties, I was somewhat familiar with at least the genetic heritage of such. Now, Sarah and I live in an apartment. And what that meant was there were certain breeds, examples shown here, that you couldn't get. That doesn't mean that all of these are always forbidden, purebred or mixes, but between that and me looking at shelters both near and far and finding many, not all, but many, fit one of these criterion in terms of breed, that meant it was highly unlikely we were going to get one from a shelter, even though that was one of Sarah's first preference on cost reasons. Then, what about a rescue dog? Well, new adopted dog safety tips from a rescue, that means they've had a home previously. Therefore, we weren't the first owners. That meant you were possibly dealing with attachment issues and things like that. Could we deal with that? Absolutely. The more pressing issue was, as shown here on this website, if you have a fenced yard, walk the perimeter and carefully inspect the fence to make sure there are no holes, gaps, or areas where even a small dog can squeeze through and escape. Assure the fence is tall enough to accommodate a large dog. Well, we have an apartment. That means there's no house, no mortgage payment, and therefore there is no common fenced yard that's solely owned by Sarah and I. That's community-owned yard, otherwise known as a dog park. But that's the best we could do. However, most of the time, a rescue dog in an apartment, well, where exactly is a fenced yard going to be? So that left a breeder as an option, and I think we got a really good deal for it. We only paid $600 to actually get the dog from the breeder, which, for a tricolor Sheltie, as I later learned from other research, is quite the bargain. I've seen prices 3 and 4 times that. One of the conditions of getting her from the breeder was that because we were in the middle of moving apartments, we only got her at 16 weeks of life back in April of 2024 in Q2, which is not shown here. So our breeder said, please pay for the initial round of vaccines and things. Normally, our breeder would give the dog to a new owner at 7 or 8 weeks old, not 16. So we got to pay for the initial expenses, and then when we were in the middle of setting up for the new apartment, well, that meant you had to sign a new lease and all that jazz, and because we were bringing a pet, well, that means you had to set up a profile and start paying pet rent. The profile shown here is just the initial fee, and that will be annual as long as we live in this apartment. So Q1 wasn't that bad. Basically all we did was pay for the initial round of things and prep for getting the dog in Q2, but that was still $750. Compared to later quarters, that's a bargain. But we'll cover that next time.